Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to welcome you here to Reykjavik, and it's an honor to have been asked to chair this panel on human rights violations and state sovereignty. Personally, I welcome all discussion on human rights and especially which what I understand is the purpose of the meeting for these 2 days is to find ways also to discuss what can be done to improve respect for human rights law and thus further peace and security. And I think it is very important, if I refer to the last words of the Minister for Foreign Affairs earlier about human rights not being internal affairs of states, and that is something that I think we maybe should touch upon under this topic. But the questions that have been put forward under this theme are what new mediating mechanisms can be used to reduce tension between geopolitics and human rights when it comes to legitimizing the responsibility to protect, and also how can the relationship between great powers and international organizations be improved in human rights implementation. Now, each panel member has been asked to limit their statements to 5 to 7 minutes, and I heard just before this meeting and also yesterday when I was speaking to some of the speakers that this is apparently something that is very challenging, but I encourage you to take that challenge, and because if we limit the time to at least not much more than 7 minutes, we have more time for discussion, and then we can all of us participate around the table. So with these words, I would like to start with inviting Mr. James Pattison, who is a professor of politics at the University of Manchester. His work focuses on the ethical issues surrounding conflict at the intersection between political philosophy and international relations. And Mr. Pattison will be speaking about the responsibility to protect and just war theory. So please, you have the floor.
So thank you. So first of all, let me just say thank you very much to our hosts for organizing this wonderful event and for inviting me here today. So I'm going to talk primarily about the first question that was on the brief. So I'm going to focus on the question of the responsibility to protect and what can be done instead of military intervention. So let me give you a bit of background about the responsibility to protect, the R2P for short. It's often slightly misunderstood. People have often got a general idea of what the R2P is, but it's often a little bit, people don't quite understand the nuances of it. So I'll spend the first 3 to 4 minutes briefly outlining, and then I'll try and say something about the alternatives to military intervention. So the R2P, the responsibility to protect for short, is the idea that states have got responsibilities to look after their own populations and to ensure that they're not subject to mass atrocities. Second, if states are unable or unwilling to do so, then the international community has a remedial responsibility to react or to help prevent mass atrocities. Now, the most obvious way is by undertaking humanitarian intervention, which we saw in 2011 in Libya. Indeed, the R2P largely developed out of discussions of humanitarian intervention, such as the unauthorized intervention in Kosovo in 1999 that lacked UN Security Council authorization, and the failure to act sufficiently in response to the genocide in Rwanda in 1994. Now, unlike the previous doctrine of humanitarian intervention in the 1990s, the R2P, the key thing that differentiates it from this previous doctrine is the notion that standing by is no longer an option. It's the notion that humanitarian intervention is not supererogatory. There's a moral obligation to intervene or to do something else in response to mass atrocities. Now, the R2P was accepted by states at the 2005 World Summit and subsequently been institutionalized in various ways. These include in national focal points, the establishment of a post of a UN Special Representative on the R2P in New York, the Atrocities Prevention Board in the US, and the development of various NGOs and lobby groups, perhaps most notably the Global Center for R2P, which is also in New York. The R2P has now become the predominant framework for discussing responses to mass atrocities. So the language of the responsibility to protect has been largely replaced the previous notion of humanitarian intervention, but is broader. So it also includes the responsibility to prevent mass atrocities and emphasizes much more, as I've already said, this notion of responsibility rather than the choice to do something. Okay, to delineate a little bit further, there are three pillars of the R2P. The first pillar is the least controversial, and that is that states have got responsibilities to look after their own populations and to ensure that they're not subject to mass atrocity crimes. Now, that clearly has foundations in international human rights law, and states very rarely contest this. The second pillar is that states have got an international responsibility to assist states that are those that are unable to fulfill this first pillar. There's a remedial international responsibility to assist states to help fulfill this pillar, to help fulfill their responsibilities. So this might be through helping them to develop early warning capacities or even more military action, so such as the intervention, the recent intervention to help protect the Yazidis in Iraq that had state consent. So Pillar 2 is all about international assistance. Pillar 3 is called timely and decisive response. This concerns the requirement of the international community to encourage, persuade, and if necessary, to coerce unwilling states to fulfill their responsibilities to address mass atrocities, and these measures are largely through the UN Security Council. And this is what I'm going to address my remarks on today. A few other points. Has the R2P made a difference? This question always comes up. Now, the R2P is still in its infancy. It's only 11 years old. But according to most commentators, it's had quite a spectacular rise and has had some influence in certain cases. Now, the influence that it can achieve is always going to be very difficult, given that geopolitical interests are always going to be there, and the R2P is only a naught. But still, it's widely credited for prompting somewhat the action in Libya, as well as the prevention of mass atrocities in Kenya and Guinea. More generally, it's claimed that the UN Security Council is now much more engaged with issues of mass atrocities, where previously they wouldn't have been on the international agenda. And in the words of the recent UN Special Representative on R2P, there is now what's called a duty of conduct. And this duty of conduct is the idea that states and the UN Security Council now at least accepts that they should be doing something in response to mass atrocities. Okay, 2 points worth highlighting why the R2P has had influence. Firstly, I think the current Secretary General of the UN has adopted a very wise, narrow, but deep approach. This has meant that its focus is on 4 types of atrocity crimes. And these are war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and genocide, rather than the previous incarnation of responsibility to protect, which broadened it out to include much more. So focusing on the 4 crimes has helped to develop consensus, adopt a deep approach as well, and to focus the sorts of means that might be included under the R2P. Secondly, and perhaps more theoretically, it helps to provide a careful balance between statism and cosmopolitanism. So cosmopolitans often want to have military intervention to try and protect human rights, whereas statists are very wary of anything to intervene and emphasize very much the sanctity of state sovereignty. Now, the R2P treads a careful balance by both by emphasizing the importance of state sovereignty, but also accepting that, along with cosmopolitans, that humanitarian intervention might, on occasion, be permissible and required. Now, as I've said, the R2P is still in its infancy, and there are various issues that still need to be developed much further, and our thinking and understanding about them needs to be improved. Now, in my view, perhaps most centrally, is I think we need to have a better understanding of the sorts of measures that we can use in Pillar 3 to try to ensure that there is a better response to mass atrocities when states are unwilling to do so, that don't involve military intervention. So we need to think about what can be done instead of military intervention to try to encourage states and coerce them if necessary to live up to their international responsibilities. Now, our understanding of the ethical and political issues raised by these options is comparatively much weaker than it is compared to military action. So, for instance, the most useful framework that we have for thinking about the ethics of military action is just war theory. So for those of you that don't know, just war theory outlines a series of principles to govern the conduct of war and to consider when war should be waged. And these include principles of last resort, legitimate authority, right intention, and proportionality. Now, just war theorists are often at pains to emphasize that war should be the last resort and that alternatives should be pursued instead. Pacifists often make similar claims. They say that we should do something instead of going to war. But pacifism and just war theory still don't really say or have a clear understanding of what should be done instead of going to war, instead of military action. So there is a gap then in the understanding of these alternatives and what should be done. Now, 5 to 7 minutes, I can't really say much about the alternatives, so I'm just going to very briefly list some of the alternatives. I can't, unfortunately, explore the ethical issues surrounding them. So probably the most obvious alternative is comprehensive economic sanctions, but as we know, this causes or can cause severe collateral harm, and the effectiveness of economic sanctions is hotly disputed. Many other measures, though, so targeted sanctions such as asset freezes, travel bans, naming and shaming and diplomatic criticism of the offending governments and even those that fail to respond, expulsion of governments from international bodies, mediation between warring parties, the cutting of aid and even the cutting of diplomatic ties to those that are engaged in mass atrocities. There are also non-coercive measures that receive far less attention, so non-violent peacekeeping by civilian peacekeeping organizations such as Non-Violent Peace Force, positive incentives to encourage states to actually fulfill their responsibilities, such as economic aid, trade, investment, and even perhaps most controversial is the use of amnesties, which raises a whole host of ethical and political issues. Accepting and assisting refugees, and humanitarian aid to the population, so assisting IDPs, internally displaced persons, or other members of the population currently enduring mass atrocities, and helping NGOs in the delivery of this aid. Now, as should be fairly obvious, these measures, some of them are going to have more going for them than others, and there's not going to be one size fits all, so various measures are going to be more suitable in certain cases than others. In addition, a combination of measures is often going to be the best. So it's not as though you're going to have one in isolation. A combination will often work best, such as a carrot combined with a stick. Now, despite that, there are still some general considerations that we can use, drawing from thinking about just war theory to try to see what might be the best option in a particular case. So we can think which option is going to be proportionate, i.e. do the most good, which option is going to have legitimate authority, be rightly intended, and so on. A couple more points and I'm going to finish. So under RTP, there's a clear collective responsibility to undertake these measures. Now, who should carry out the particular responsibilities will differ, depending on their suitability according to these requirements. So it might be that a particular state is best placed to undertake a particular measure. And I think that smaller states, actually, so the ones that aren't the major powers, are often particularly best suited to undertake some of these measures, such as naming and shaming. Now, they have less tainted reputations and can avoid some of the counterproductive resentment that come with action by larger states. But this shouldn't let larger states off the hook, though. Under the responsibility to protect, responsibility is collectively held. So even if a smaller state is carrying some of the burdens of fulfilling using a particular measure, the international community and the major powers still have responsibilities to try and assist and support those who are carrying out the primary burdens. So this is often missed. There is a responsibility to support others' actions. So to recap, there's a lot more that can be done than simply military intervention under the RTP. Accepting this doesn't deny that military intervention is sometimes appropriate. I think it is, others disagree. Sometimes nothing will work to fully address the crisis, arguably is the case has been recently in Syria. At best it can be only ameliorated, but a better understanding, I think, of the options will help to avoid the choice in response to mass atrocities is either intervening militarily or doing nothing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pattison, and definitely there are other options, and in my work I would sometimes like to see more just old-fashioned diplomacy being carried out worldwide, people speaking to countries speaking to other countries that they do not necessarily agree with, because that is the value of dialogue is highly underestimated, I think.